the Wednesday episode of the Dollar Bandits. It's Oren here joining you today, and we have a wonderful guest. We're talking about artist Scott Kolins. Scott's currently working on The Flash with Geoff Johns, but he's worked on a new number of different projects through the years. I was about to say numerous, but it's a number of different projects. Started out at Valiant. A lot of folks we've had started out there. Some wonderful stories about that. Worked on Star Wars, so many other projects. So I think you're going to love what Scott has to say. I know I did. Scott Kolins. Scott Kolins joining us this evening. Sir, how are you?
I'm great, thank you.
So let's start at the very beginning. How did you first discover comics?
How did I first discover comics? I was pretty young, five or maybe six, and back in those days, there weren't comic shops yet, so they were mostly still sold in newsstands or those things. And I was running with my friends through basically all sorts of, I guess, one of those old dime stores.
Mhm.
Ran across them on a magazine rack, and it literally stopped me in my tracks. The rest of my friends went on running through the store to where we were heading to candy or something. And I think it was, as I remember it was two issues of The Incredible Hulk that caught my eye. And I sat down in front of that magazine rack and I read both issues at least once, if not more. And then I think I had money enough to grab both the issues, but it took all my candy money.
So in life, how do you then make the decision that this might be a career you'd like to pursue?
That was a bit of a process. As soon as I got the comics, I still wasn't really aware of the credits and all of that that was going on with the books yet.
Mhm.
I just knew that I really liked that stuff. And my own natural inclination was to get a pencil and a piece of paper and start either drawing those characters or actually right almost from the get-go. I just thought everybody did this sort of thing or whatever on the side or whatnot. So I would come up with characters and all those things on my own. And bless my mom, she would always find more paper and pencils for me all the time. That was just something that I gravitated towards. And then through grade school to high school, I would meet other friends that were into comic books. Most of them weren't into drawing. It was just the reading and collecting. Um, but by junior high time, so 12 years old, somewhere around there, um, through somebody on my paper route that I had back then.
Mhm.
He knew that there actually was a comics professional living in my hometown. Um, and he gave me his name and number or whatever it was, because I think they went to the same church. So he knew about, they knew each other and they were friends. Um, and anyway, I wound up contacting him and we eventually formed a club with, I don't know, like 15 of us in town or whatnot. See, we're all these kids who eventually found out about this poor guy, and we kept descending upon his house at random times, and he wasn't getting work done. So he's like, okay, guys, we're going to meet like once a week over here. Actually, I think it was still part of their church,
Mhm.
in one of the like meeting rooms or banquet rooms or whatever it was. But meeting him was that pivotal point. Up until then, I had considered it just pure hobby, fantasy, whatever that I was doing these drawings. I hadn't been too serious about making sure I was doing stories or this or that. I was either drawing images out of the books that I read, or coming up with new characters. I was always doing that. But yeah, then meeting him, and I saw he was married. I saw he lived in a house. All of those adult things, so that I could. And it really was that thought process of like I could go to my mom and dad and say, "There's an adult. He does this as a job. This is what I want to do." Um, and that was that was a major turning point, was knowing that it was a real thing. Then seeing from him, seeing real pages, seeing he was, as fate would have it, as the weird trick would be, he was inking the Flash,
Oh,
um, over Carmine Infantino. And actually, the one of the funnest bits about it was that not only was I seeing how pages were produced and done and everything else, a couple of us, that his name was Dennis Jensen at the
okay.
time, for those searching through the libraries of stuff. Um, Dennis actually got us to do like some backgrounds here or there,
Wow.
some trees or some buildings or different things, whatnot. And we got to see kind of how it was all put together, at least in some ways. Um, and that was all great. And it definitely propelled me along. So I started making my own pages, doing those things. But then it wasn't honestly, it still didn't become a real thing even at that point until I went to the Kubert School
Mhm.
in New Jersey. After I had tried my local college, which failed abysmally because their art programs were not built for that kind of artwork at all.
Right.
Literally, my professors just scratched their heads and went, "I don't know how to help you," because I showed them what I wanted to do, and
Right.
I think colleges are much better about that now, but at that time anyway, they had no connection at all. So I went to the Kubert School, and not only did that give me a whole mess of my next stage of learning of actually creating these pages and books and stories and the whole bit, and learning the different parts of the system of the coloring and the lettering and inking as well as penciling and stuff. Um, then it also put me within trains ride or car ride distance to Manhattan, where the companies really were at that time. To I was just thinking about that this morning as
Mm.
the times have gone by now. That it was a much different world back then, where you had some independent books and publishers here and there,
Right.
but they were scattered few. If you really wanted to work in the industry, it really was just Marvel and DC, which is really not the case at all anymore.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about, the different projects you worked on, but we're talking about penciling and inking before. You've done both. So let me start off with, for you as a penciler, what are you looking for as from an inker that you think helps bring the best out of what you've done?
Um, it is that it's almost like being in a band kind of mix in that I like inkers when I was working with them to bring their own artistic sense to this equation of what we're trying to pull off. Um, and then it's whether those two systems or those two artistic influences or whatnot, whether they gel and actually work really well or not. I've had really good inkers that we just didn't gel.
Mhm.
And sometimes it takes time for those things, months or longer, to really gel stuff. But other times, it can happen really fast. I mean, I've got lucky sometimes. I've had Klaus Janson,
Mhm.
um, and I think we actually did gel really well. But it was under the auspice when I got the job, knowing that Klaus was going to ink the job. And I was
Right.
like, great, I get Klaus Janson pages back when this is all done. So, I don't care if they all look like Klaus, because he's such an amazing pro. But at the same time, like when we started the Flash run, um, I had done a fill-in issue first about a year, almost a year before, where I got in. I asked for an inker that I knew, John Holdridge, and he did a decent job on the issue. But John and I had been bouncing around at that point on various jobs, a bunch of different times, and sometimes we did really well on maybe a certain character or a certain thing, and other times then I felt like we were butting heads on stuff, even though all of our artistic fluences were the same. And yet, then when I actually started the monthly Flash run,
Mhm.
it was the editor who brought in Doug Hazelwood, and I'd kind of known of his stuff, but I had no idea how in the world we were going to gel or not. But I was like, sure, let's give it a go and see how it was. Doug was great.
Right.
Doug absolutely fit in magically, uh, much stronger than almost any other DC Inc. or ever. Any other guys who obviously he's busy doing his own stuff now. But Dan was one of the other few guys that I thought we gelled really well as far as me having an inker doing stuff. But that is ultimately why, in most cases, why I want to be myself.
Now, as an inker, when you were doing some inking, did you look at it as to enhance what the penciler had done or to modify what he had done to make it stand out a little more, in your eyes?
Usually, it was a matter of, again, that band thing of like mixing our influences and trying to get the best out of it. I was usually trying to be conscious of the fact of like, okay, this isn't my penciling job. Let me see what I can bring to this guy. Maybe certain details or light sources or different things that I might be able to bring to some other penciler. I worked over Geoff Johnson a number of times,
Mhm.
and that was pretty much what it came down to. Was Geoff had all of the major pieces and everything that we needed out of a page or a story or the figure work or whatnot going on, and it was just like, oh, can I accent this facial expression he's got a little bit stronger so it's a little more readable, or whatever I could possibly bring to it. But it was usually under that idea of like, okay, I haven't inked that many people on
Mhm.
uh, published jobs. But it would be under that thing of like, I'm going to wind up bringing what I do to the game regardless, because it just can't go away. I'm not going to disappear. But how can I work best within what they've got and then make it better, hopefully?
Are there any books or projects that you look back now as sort of evolutionary points for you, where maybe you discovered something about your art and that change led to another change that led to where you are now?
Yeah. Actually, I mean, there were just those first jobs where, that rubber hits the road,
Right.
where all of a sudden you're like, oh, I've got all this highfalutin ideals about I want to be Bernie Wrightson or Barry Smith or whatever else going on, or Jack Kirby or all these things. But then when it comes down to it, and I'm not saying the thought process is, doesn't have an effect on this, but ultimately what comes out of, your hand onto that page, through the pen, through the pencil, whatever it might be, or a brush if you're painting, whatever it is, it's going to build a life of its own, kind of almost separate from your intentions. At least for me, because I was never one of those guys who, like a Wrightson or some other ones we've heard of. I think Kirby was another one, Perez, where they could just look at the page for a while,
Mhm.
envision the whole thing, and then just start filling it in like it was done. I'm much more of like almost sculpting out of that paper to finally get the figure work or something. Even if I have a vision of what the layout is and everything going on with it, oh, I'm always struggling with actually getting it to be what I see in my head. That doesn't come so easy.
And to that point, you've worked on the biggest iconic characters with Marvel and DC. When you
Yeah.
get assignments like that, is there a nervousness to put your own spin on these characters? Or have you gotten to the point now where you're like, you know what? I trust my own abilities. I know what I'm doing when it comes to this stuff like this.
That is actually one of the other points, relating to your earlier question too. There were those nervous times, depending upon the character, and there are ones even like hangups in the back of my head that even as a kid I remember some characters came easier and some characters came tougher.
Mhm.
Like when I was a kid, actually, I had a really hard time drawing Batman. I
Mhm.
don't know why. I have no clue. But that has stuck with me so that when I got to draw him in the actual, published books for DC, there were times when I was struggling more with it than with other characters. Again, I'm going, come on, I got to get past this. Um, but there is just that natural inclination, I think. Again, despite any of the conscious things, the choices that you would have had, or any expectations that you would have had about all this,
Mhm.
like me with the Flash. I had no clue I was going to have an affinity for this character this way, drawing him and being, decently good at running figures and that kind of stuff. Um, when I did the one fill in issue, I forget what kind of time constraint we were under. I don't think it was terrible, but I remember being like, okay, I just got one issue to draw the Flash. That's all I got. So I got to, kick ass as hard as I can on all of this,
Right.
and see how it goes. And again, with other previous projects at the time, depending upon the book, there might have been a whole lot of redrawing and cussing and swearing and all that, throwing pages around with why it's not working. But with Flash, it didn't do that. Even on that fill-in issue right from the beginning, when I got to those running poses, that flowed real easily, which I guess was, a big, uh, you know, um, not a warning sign, but an auspicious thing of going like, no, this works. And DC responded as well. They really loved it. That's why they offered me the monthly book, was because of that one fill-in issue. So, and then most everybody else who has looked at the run has always responded to it. So it's just something that is semi-unconscious about it. I work at it and I think about it and I do all that, but most of the time it's really not a struggle.
I was to say with the Flash, but I mean, you captured the motion so beautifully. I'm just so curious about that because this is a character who is faster than everyone else.
Yeah.
So you need to, his thoughts, his facial expressions, no one's
Yeah.
seeing them but him, and everything is moving so quickly. How do
Yeah.
you break down those moments to capture, what he's feeling, what he's thinking while there's so much movement going on?
And there was some of that while I was starting on the book, especially when I was offered the monthly, regular job of it, was going well. I even asked, the head honcho, editorial at the time, Mike Carlin, who wasn't my editor on the Flash, but I knew he was one of the, executive, almost editors that,
Right.
had a hand in me being put on the job. And I'd worked with him a bunch of times and trusted his judgment and all that kind of stuff. And I asked him when I got the job, before I started on the regular books, I said, "What are you looking for?" And he goes, "I'm looking for a Scott Collins Flash that we haven't seen before." No pressure there. Um, but again, as you know, the luck hand of fate can move along. I had been working on that open line style in some sketchbooks that I had around my studio, and my studio mates got to see them. And I was generally getting favorable reviews on them from all of my friends. They liked what they saw, even though to my mind, I felt in some ways like it was weird or cheating or something like that, because it wasn't based off of the standard styles that I was raised with all the shadows, with all the rendering, all of this kind of things. It was just the simple, almost, Mobius kind of linear world of doing that stuff. And although I truly appreciate Mobius, I can never say he was actually a major influence. I've
Right.
had his stuff around, but it wasn't like I've studied and studied his stuff like I've done for Kirby or Byrne or half of these guys, Perez around. Those guys, I mean, I've made a point of studying what I think works and what doesn't work and all that kind of thing. Anyway, I don't know where we are right now
I
with the
don't know.
question.
I'm curious because you mentioned something, what was Mr. Carlin said, but in your mind, what is the Scott Collins style?
Oh, right, that flash style. Okay, well, like almost anything else, again, like music or anything else that you're going to do with anything that is artistic, um, you're going to have your influences. You're going to bring them in. A friend and I were just looking at some Michael Golden stuff the other day,
Hmm.
and he mentioned the certain thing that he saw Michael do with a background that had actually related to speed. They had a car running along and what he was doing, and he did all the neat little tricks that made you feel the motion of this car that was running down the street at a decent pace. And I went, it reminded me that that was definitely one of the pieces of the puzzle that I brought in. When like, oh, okay, he tilted this and he did this, and he would, instead of drawing shadows in the background, he kind of maybe outline the shadows, but then put speed lines in those shadows, or
Right.
different things like that. But as far as my style of Flash, I guess I can label it as handling those different speed factors. And one of them that I actually apparently did bring in more, I'm certainly not the only one, was the sort of 3D effect of his speed.
Mhm.
I quickly found that some of my favorite poses of Flash running, even when he coming to a stop or any of those things, was very much a very strong foreshortened aspect to what was going
Mhm.
on. Either that his hands were out, almost in a Kirby fashion that were in your face, or even the other ones where I wasn't trying to make it cartoony, big feet like a Mickey Mouse kind of a thing, or the other guys at the time when I broke in. There were lots of guys that were doing a much cartoonier, almost Saturday morning style. But I was doing a very like what I thought was a more 3D but anatomical 3D thing going on. So the boot of Flash as he's skidding to a halt might be really big and everything, but I would flow the whole body into that 3D process, and then I would throw in all the detail too, which also became one of my little calling cards or hallmarks back then. Of when he was skidding on the road and coming to a halt, I'm cracking the heck out of that cement and I'm having pieces fly all over the place and all sorts of stuff. In fact, with my linear style, part of my artwork did really flow into all that detail stuff. So that I started drawing every window in the background of those the buildings that were there, or all those pieces of a car that you have to draw when you're doing the hubcap and the reflection, this and that. And I'm not hiding anything with the shadows in any of that stuff, which again, all apparently really worked. And I've already mentioned Doug and how great he was in it, but the colorist team and everything that we had at that time, we were, luckily all drawn together with Geoff Johns writing, with me in there, with Doug on the inks, with James Sinclair on the coloring, with Digital Chameleon that were doing the color separations at that point, and Gaspar was doing the lettering. We really had a nice little magical team that had all come together at the right time, right place. Because
Right.
any one of those pieces taken out, the book would have been half as good.
You mentioned the run you have on Flash. When you're working on a book, what kind of communication, what kind of relationship do you like to have with the writer? Because sometimes we hear that, there's some back and forth between them. They want to work together. Other times you find out that the artist is just sort of given a script. and told do what you want, and there's no communication with the writer, and
Yeah.
it's just that's the way it is. Which do you prefer, and which works best for you?
What's funny is I've worked almost in the total opposite ends of the spectrum during my career. Most of the initial jobs I got, which is probably for the benefit, were full script um, that could wean me into the idea, that process of always being able to take somebody's words and captions and whatnot and then fit them into a page and how it's going to work. If I would have been given only plots at the beginning, that would have been the deep end of the pool.
Right.
I think could have been able to do it, but um, it worked for me in that process. So I worked with the Geoff Johnses, a million of different writers who had full scripts, and a fair amount of communication in their script, and then also a fair amount of communication over the phone or emails as we would talk about stuff. While Geoff and I were working on Flash, we talked almost every day. When I was working with Keith Giffen on various projects, we talked almost every day. Robert Kirkman, I talked to a lot. There's a bunch of them. There's only been one on the top of my head that I worked with that I had almost no communication with. In fact, I emailed him at the beginning of the project. It was Bruce Jones on a project that was called Hulk Wolverine 6 Hours. And I know Bruce Jones is an old pro and all of that kind of stuff. So, but anyway, when we started the project, I reached out to him, and I was used to a bunch of writers where there was a lot of communication. But after my initial hello, he wrote back in an email and said hello. He goes, but to basically answer a question, unless there's really something that, leans towards a writer question of it, he goes, if you have any questions, ask the editor. He goes, when I'm done with the project, at least that was his viewpoint on that project with me. He goes, when I'm done with it, I hand it to the editor. If the editor approves it, he's done. He goes, I'm done. I've gotten paid. I'm on to the next thing.
Wow.
Which was a little bit different for me. And I think actually there was part of that Hulk Wolverine that suffered for that. But everybody's got their own process. So I worked with the Geoff Johnses that were full script to talk to me every day. Only a couple of them that the writers weren't actually very communicative. Usually they really want to chat about the whole story and that connection. But also on the other end of the spectrum, I did talk to Keith Giffen a lot while working with him. But he was very much like, and he never put it this way, but he was much more in the idea of like jazz musician kind of a thing. He would hand me a story, and I would say, well, what do you think about doing this and that? He's like, do what you want.
Wow.
And I went, what? He goes, as long as you give me the ABC that I put in the story, and you don't take me off to Z somewhere that I had no clue of. He goes, but if you want to put Z in between A and B, or mess it around to do this and that, he was very much into all it. In fact, there were moments of times when, well, I knew more what was going on with the book than the editors did. He wouldn't tell the editors half of what was going on. And B, there were times again, like when we were working on Blue Beetle, that I'd be like, oh, but you got this cool thing, but I was thinking that the Scarab might really kind of do this, and because there was an opening sequence in issue 2 or 3. Where we wanted that the villain was going to be tapping into the Scarab's powers, that kind of stuff, but by like distance and this and that. So he wanted Jaime to wind up getting to almost the layer of the base, but not knowing how he's getting there or whatever else. And I said, well, what if it happens like in the, and Keith stopped it. And he's just like, do it. And I went, but I don't want to screw up anything you're doing later. And he's like, I'll change it. I'll fix it. I'll do this and that. And I found out this is how he worked with a lot of people that he worked with McGuire, with DeMatteis, all those guys, or Timothy's, that's the enjoyment out of the play for him, was that he'd go, okay, I've given you, Superman, and he's on the planet Krypton, and, Brainiac's attacking. Go. And I go, oh, but what if he attacked this way and did this and that? And he's like, yep, give that to me when it comes back. And he said him and Mark DeMatteis would do this all the time, where Mark would get his plots, and then Mark would go, right, but, oh, you implied this. And if we could do this with it, and then he would send it back to Keith, and Keith would go, I had no clue we were going there, but okay, let's do this now. And Keith was just so much fun for all of that. He really just was like, let's play, let's have fun. He didn't sometimes want to know where it was going to go. Which would to his mind, as he would describe it, or did describe it, he said, talking to Julie Schwartz back in the day, according to Julie Schwartz, the greatest sin of any comic book ever, anytime, was if the kid knew what was going to happen, either on the next page or by the end of the book. If they knew it was going to happen, you've lost the entire game. And he goes, we spend so much time on our plots and everything, and we knowing where it's going to go. He goes, we're always giving the tell. We're always, they know what's going to happen by the end of it. And he goes, and that's just absolutely the opposite of real good fun entertainment, whether it's for kids or anybody else. So he was always fun for all that stuff. So I've had that kind of all over the place kind of repartee working with people, and it's fun finding different systems.
Do you enjoy having, I mean, because you've had a long run on books, and you've also, done some smaller things here and there. Do you enjoy the long run, or do you like just doing maybe a story arc, then trying your hand at something else? Which one works best for you?
Generally the longer run,
Okay.
because even on Flash, as much as it sort of came naturally, like you're asked before about those markers, when all of a sudden I notice something changes or I get more insights into what I want to do. It took about till issue 4 of Geoff and my run of Flash before I went, oh, there's Wally's face. I just drew the one. I know this one now. And now I can draw that in this pose, that pose, that pose, whatever I need. So I usually take months to really get in the groove of a whole thing. Even while I was working on Blue Beetle or any of the ones, once I get past that 4 month range or somewhere in there, I go, oh, I figured out these codes for what I need to do for this whole thing. And to me, it always gets stronger, stronger, stronger.
Mhm.
And I find that most other creators have been that way in the past too. The runs that I like the best of people are the ones that did go on for years or at
Mhm.
least for months or something like that. But it's not that I don't like the one-off either. I did a one-off of the Dark Side one shot, and things like that. And I can certainly see where, in some cases, where if the project wasn't going well, then all of a sudden doing it for 3 years might might not be that much fun.
Well, I mean, to that point, how do you not hit a wall, and how do you at that catch yourself in a moment where you feel like, you know what, I think I've done all I can on this project.
I've learned over time now more that you can hit those walls, but you really can get past them,
Mhm.
um, by changing your system, by changing different things going on. Ultimately, that was one of the reasons that I left Flash when I left at 200, was I felt like I had almost reached that point, where I had done as far as uh, all I saw at that point, which I think we did differently after that. But I felt like up to that point, I was like, well, now I'm going to be repeating myself. I've written my best albums of these songs, and I'm just going to be knocking out repeats of that same thing, if I'm not careful and not too worried about it. And I've heard about plenty of other professionals over the years that have had that same issue when they had those long runs working on stuff. Perez talked about that on Titans, that was a big thing for him at one point, where he really felt like he needed to change the book because he felt like he was just on that same bike running that same treadmill over and over again.
Talking about creating a little bit, you've also had a hand in creating characters for the different books. When you're thinking about creating a character, where does the blueprint begin? Is it a name, an ability, a physical aspect? Where do you start and then build from?
I'm assuming you're only talking about the new characters that we might add, like new
Yeah.
villains or different things like that. Um, well, I guess even if it was doing a revamp, it's mostly, again, like I even try with my artwork, to tailor it toward whatever the job would be.
Mhm.
So when we created new villains for on the Flash book, a lot of those came from Geoff. He would have the initial idea of what he wanted for Tar Pit or some of the other ones, but excuse me, there were characters within that bunch that I had suggested, like the younger kid version of Trickster.
Mhm.
Um, I just had that idea pop in my head, and it was all geared to what works for that book.
Right.
Um, like when I was working on Solomon Grundy stuff, we didn't have new characters in there, but I was like, how many cool different kinds of monsters can I put in this book? So he's fighting a different monster, and something that would work for the book, which included surprisingly some characters that I didn't think were going to work in Ish. they suggested a bunch of characters to me, and then I was cherry picking from there. But one of them, I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, they were really kind of pushing was Poison Ivy, and I was like, "What's Poison Ivy going to do with Solomon Grundy? I don't have no clue how in the world this is going to work." And yet, that one and even the Amazo was another one that I had no idea what in the world I was going to do with. Both of those were some of my favorite issues, actually, out of the bunch. Once I got into it, I went, I have no idea. Oh, wait, they've got this. Like for Ivy, I went, oh, but I made this whole push and basis for my series was to really push the whole connection between Grundy and the Slaughter Swamp, the swamp that he always comes from. That most people don't wind up doing that much. I'm like, I want the swamp in every issue if I can get it in there. Right. And I loved him almost having that sort of almost evil version of a Swamp Thing connection. I had the plants of the swamp feeding into him and doing all sorts of stuff, since he's supposed to be actually made out of plant matter or almost something like that. Anyway, I found that connection with Poison Ivy or with this character or that character that I didn't see. So it's usually still tailored towards whatever the book might be. I created a character for Legion of Superheroes that they wound up calling Gear. I had a different name for him when I created him. But the idea was, I think they said, hey, and if you want to make a new character, we could plop him in this issue or something like that at the time. Right. And I had to go through the list going, well, what kind of character did they make for Legion of Superheroes that they don't already have 50 of? Right. And so I came up with that guy who was, basically a robot machine man kind of guy who was AI for its time. It was basically a living, thinking machine. But I thought that would be really fun, and I hadn't seen that necessarily in all the other Legion books. So it's usually still bound by the project. Even on the new Patra stuff that I was putting together, there were sequences of where James and Robinson and I were talking about the book and what we wanted to do with it. And then he would mention that he wanted this doctor psychiatrist to be in the book. Okay. And I asked him, trying to be, working part of the team again, of like, well, what do you see this guy? And he goes, I don't know. I have no idea what he looks like. Hey, so then I'm trying different things of what I then saw him doing. Or the Jeremy Jones, the other serial killer that's in the story. I know we had some basis for like the movies that we were pulling from, like Halloween and Friday the 13th and all that kind of stuff. But then I went, okay, but he can't be those. So I have to come up with another imagery that hopefully could be semi as strong as, what those movies had done. And then I came up with, the blade mask that he has on and that he takes off and uses as actually as a knife as well. And went, okay, I don't think I've seen that before, but it's geared towards this kind of horror book.
When you're doing this, though, in the back of your mind, you have to sort of remember that this has to be a repeatable character. Like, you don't want to put a ton of details in, because every panel you're going to have to take your time to make sure it matches the previous panel. Like, you don't want to simplify it, but you want to make it so that you're not there all day, doing these little dots here and there.
Well, you can still wind up there all day. But yeah, have I avoided making a Jack of Hearts or something like that? Yes. I've tried to avoid any of those inclinations of doing something that's over complex. Though, even some of those that I did make, ultimately to me, to draw them properly and do them right, the thought process was really simple. Like on the Trickster that I made him, that Geoff was the one who named him Axel. But I just came up with this initial sketch, and I sent it off to Geoff, and I went, what if we made Trickster just like an evil version of Robin? Right. I wanted him to be that kid who's running around, and then he's got his bombs and his toys and whatever else going on with it. But then even just that simple thing of like, okay, well, are we putting, initially I think I had ha-has written all over his gloves. Yeah. And I think we wound up changing it to yo-yos because DC thought that was going to be too close to Joker or something like that. But even in those things that I put on the gloves or any other details of his costume, ultimately they do wind up taking time, and especially do them how I wanted them, because him being a modern, kid character, this and that, I wanted all the bells and whistles for him. Like when I did it properly, which I did on some covers and I tried on some of the books, but it was too time taking for most people to deal with. I wanted that wording on the gloves and whatnot. I wanted glowing. I wanted like lit up. I wanted him to have all those little, things that kids would be into. I mean, for crying out loud, I just bought a new tea kettle, um, and there weren't many choices at the store, but the one is there. When I hit the tea kettle to heat up the water, it's got a whole ring of like neon lights in there. That's for kids, and people are like, "Well, that's a fancy tea kettle." Like, I didn't pick that, but it seemed, like for Trickster and stuff, it seems it's got that youthful vibe. That's what would kids would want to do. If
Right.
I was 16 and I was this crazy guy who would have these exploding toys or bubble gum that I'm going to throw at somebody and it's going to take them over and all the great stuff that Geoff wrote, like he's going to want everything going on. He's going to want Fourth of July fireworks all the time.
It- you sort of you make your name at DC with the Flash and other projects. When you get to Marvel to do some work, is it carte blanche? Do they know you, they trust you, and you can do as you like, or is there still sort of a getting to know you process?
There was still some getting to know me. I mean, I did technically, yes, gain my next level of my life in the industry
Mhm.
by being on the Flash, but I had already been in for like 7 years before I was on Flash, and actually I had worked at Marvel a fair amount.
Mhm.
So I had done a Hawkeye miniseries, which is
Mhm.
actually for the Vos that follow me along. He's
Right.
one of my other regular requests for commissions or for when I sign books at the conventions and stuff. It's Flash comics, it's Avengers comics, and then a lot of times it'll be Hawkeye or Blue Beetle or something like that. But so when I went to Marvel after the Flash job, and there was a whole bunch of back and forth within there. I still talked to DC a bunch about different things I could have done.
Mhm.
None of them seemed to fit with DC at that time. They weren't amenable to the other things that I was proposing to them, and actually both Geoff Johns and I were proposing to them. It just didn't fit for some reason. So when I went back and talked to Marvel, I actually talked to an editor I knew before any of the Flash time came around. I reached out to him and said, would Marvel be interested in doing some stuff? Would you want to do that? Um, and then yeah, I got the immediate response back, and everything was positive. And then it was kind of a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle piece of finding where and how and when to work it all in. Um, that editor I talked to, who was Tom Brevoort, I think we initially both then talked about like, okay, well, what do you want to do,
Mhm.
or what's going on these days, and what might be a good fit. And we named a couple different things, but then I think it was Casada who stepped in at one point. He says, "Just put them on Avengers," which sure, okay, not going to fight that idea. Um, yeah, so then that happened, or then I was under contract with them for a while. So then it often became that kind of thing where they would hand me, or tell me about two or three different ideas
Mhm.
that were brewing and stuff that was going to be available when this job finished, when Avengers was over, or um, all the other things I worked on, Marvel Team Up or
Mhm.
Beyond, or any of these things. They go, oh, well, okay, well, we've got this one over here. Do you like this one, or do you like this one? That
Right.
kind of thing. So yeah,
Is
it's
it?
it's it's always a bit of a weird fix to see, what you're into, but then also what's available at their publishing schedule at that time. Because there's tons of books. I mean, I got to do most of the ones I wanted at DC because I was there ultimately longer, which again is just by hook or crook. That's not by any sort of
Right.
plan. Um, but there were tons of things at Marvel that I wish that I'd had a longer run there to work on. Things like my first comic book being the Hulk when I was a kid. I
Right.
never got to do a Hulk monthly or even much more than that Hulk Wolverine 6 hours miniseries. Which, if you remember at that time with the Bruce Jones stuff, part of the hallmark of that framework of those Hulk comics, the
Mhm.
Hulk wasn't really in much of them. It
Right.
was mostly Bruce Banner stuff running around, and then you get like 2 pages of the Hulk, which was fine, but it wasn't really feeding the artistic thing that I would have liked to have done with the book. But you do the best you can.
Oh, I'd say so. One other project you worked on, uh, which I think is really cool, is you were a little stuff for Star Wars. So
Yeah,
with Star Wars, I we hear from different people that there's either sometimes a lot of cooks in the kitchen, making
yeah,
sure everything you do fits,
yeah,
what they're looking for. And sometimes you hear they're just sort of like hands off, do as you please because maybe it's not anything that they're too in love with. What was your experience like with that?
Well, ultimately, mine was fairly brief,
Mhm.
especially as far as comics are concerned, because that was still when Dark Horse had the license from the 90s. Um, and I had worked with Dark Horse a couple times on little things here and there, a Godzilla story or some different things as we just, our paths crossed. Um, and they came to me with, I'm assuming you're talking about, I don't even know what it's called, the Star Wars, the
Essential Guide.
Oh, the essential guide work.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's completely different then. Okay, so I've had three basic connections to Star Wars over my career. The essential guide
Mhm.
was because one of I was in a studio of artists,
Mhm.
and his name was Brandon McKinney. He had been doing other Star Wars books, sort of related stuff, through different publishers, book publishers, and things like that. Um, he brought me in on that essential guide to the planets. Um, I think it was a deadline thing as well, in that he was just not going to have enough time when they gave him the project finally. He'd have
Mhm.
enough time to do the alien creatures, and I think he was doing a background shot of the city or some major piece of that planet they were working on,
Mhm.
and then I just did the like almost diagram drawing of the planet and the
Mhm.
crust or whatever the core was, and those kind of things. Um, and that was fun and interesting to do. It was a bit weird because I was only drawing those diagrams.
Right.
But you know, we're all massive Star Wars fans, so it was just anything you could do. But in the same then string of doing Star Wars stuff, um, which came next? The next was the coloring books.
Mhm.
I worked on four coloring books for episodes 1 and episode 2.
Okay.
Um, and that again came around because that studio mate Brandon had an inside job of again doing a Star Wars job,
Mhm.
um, and it was episode 1 stuff, and we were all living in the Bay Area at the time, around
Right.
San Francisco and Berkeley, so we weren't far from Lucas Ranch and everything at that time. Um, and while he was up there working on his book, he was mostly working in an editor's office. They didn't have like an artist section for him to work in because he was still a freelancer.
Right.
But while he was working on that, his editor said, "Hey, I've got these coloring books I need to get done too. Do you know any artists?" And we all had to be in the area
Yeah.
because, especially for episode 1, more than later ones, George had everything locked down. There was no email. There was no sending stuff digitally. None of those things. Everything had to stay on the ranch because he didn't want
Right.
any spoilers to get out. So again, we were super lucky in the fact that we were within driving distance of the ranch, basically, like an hour, maybe an hour and a half, that we would commute. And for 3 months or so, a couple of us, me and Geoff Johnson, also in the studio, we got to drive to Lucas Ranch like 3 days out of the week, um, and go work there. And it was just amazing because then, because we had gone through the first coloring book, for the next ones, they even gave us like this super great pass so that, well, you're going to be working here all the time. We can't just put you in this meeting rooms because sometimes we need the meeting rooms for other meetings or just some random places there. It goes, there's a main actual artist area
Wow.
that they worked on the top floor of the main building that the art director for episode 1, if not 2 and 3, I
Mhm.
can't remember his name right now. I'm the worst at names. He was still up there on that third floor. His paintings that laid out that you've seen in the art of books for episode 1 and everything were there on his wall. Super nice guy.
Yeah.
Super nice guy. He said, "Yeah, come in. We got tables down over here." That's where Ian McKegg and all these other guys were creating all the aliens and everything that were going on. Oh boy, what a kid in a candy store that was. Um, so yeah, we got to look at all those pictures of it. We got to hold models of some of the aircrafts and the spaceships, everything, all that stuff. Um, so I got to work on those coloring books, which was awesome. And then what I thought you were talking about was that Dark Horse had reached out to me to
Mhm.
do a Star Wars comic book. This would have been 2012, just before I started on Larfleeze.
Mhm.
Um, Now this was a Star Wars project where it was different than all the other ones in that it was based off of George's like first script of Star Wars.
Okay. Mhm.
So it was about Luke Starkiller, not Skywalker, and all those different things. And actually, no, may not even been Luke. might have been Anakin Starkiller, as I'm trying to remember it now, because all of that other stuff was all changed, rearranged, and everything else as he figured out the
Right.
story going on. Han Solo was in there, Chewbacca was in there, but Chewbacca, I don't think was called Chewbacca, and he didn't look like Chewbacca. But Han Solo had a different guy. It was an alien that
Okay.
was his backup guy or whatnot. Anyway, they said, "Do you want to try and do this comic book?" And I said, "Sure." Um, and I did like a 6-page tryout, a test, which then I found out, I think after I finished it, I don't think they told me before I finished the 6 pages, that again, was a very nice, lucky thing
Mhm.
that then they told me that the project had not been approved and they wanted to take those pages to George and have him approve the project. And apparently they had tried, my editor on that project told me they had tried a couple times and
Yeah.
George had said no every time. And then making myself sound like a genius,
Yeah.
George approved it that time for whatever crazy reason.
Yeah.
The even crazier twist of the story was by the time it got approved, because it took months for it to get approved, that's when I had that opportunity then to work with Keith on Larfleeze. And I had already agreed to do a monthly book. And I
Right.
couldn't do this whole Star Wars thing and do that stuff. To answer the other half of your question about the editorial cooks in the pot and all those
Right.
things going on, all of my experience with Star Wars stuff was there were always lots of cooks in there and everybody was in there.
Yeah.
And I'll admit, one of my own, I think, weaknesses out of being a commercial artist and doing all that stuff that I just never been able to get that good at was doing likenesses.
Okay.
And for the coloring books and the other things that I did in there, that was the toughest part of the job. It wasn't figuring out the spaceships and doing other things. It was to make it look like Princess Amidala or any of those characters at different times, because just never that good at it. Which was ultimately, I think, in my favor why I wound up lucky enough to be on Larfleeze and not do that one Star Wars comic book. Because I think it went fine, but I think it also would have been a bit tougher to get through the whole. I want to say it was like a 4-issue miniseries, 5-issue miniseries. My 6-page trial pages are still published in the collections of this book. They got some other artists. I can't remember his name either. He was brilliant. He
Right.
did a way better job than I would have
But it's still got to be pretty awesome that if it wasn't for your art, it wouldn't have gotten the ball rolling on this. And you were one of the first people to take this original idea and sort of bring it to life artistically.
I tried, and yes, I seem to have gotten lucky enough in that situation. Honestly, I feel like the guy that they did get to the monthly book, if he would have done the trial pages, I think it proved him.
Huh.
I think it was just a matter of timing, right timing, this and that. But am I gonna at some point, most of my work, anything that I've done for Star Wars,
Mhm.
at some point that all has to be approved through George or those pretty close to George, so they have to know his taste and his appreciation of stuff.
Right.
So yeah, I think my stuff gets along well with their vibe of the stuff. But yeah, not gonna pat myself too hard on that one.
Oh, no, no, no. You should, man. It's part of
No,
Star Wars
it's nice.
history.
Yes, yes.
We've seen so many people now with the rise of the Kickstarters and the things like that, putting out their own books, taking their own ideas and putting it out there for the world. I know
Right,
you've
right.
done some, your own projects and stuff. Do you see that as a direction that you are going to take more going forward, or are you happy doing the work with the DC and the Marvels as well?
I think I see it as an extra piece of the pie that, yeah, I'm probably going to have to spend maybe some more and more time on. I've avoided in some ways in the past, though I've considered it a reality since like the year 2000 or whenever I first started hearing about Kickstarter.
Mhm.
Um, I like the idea of it and everything. I just also know, and I know some people, a bunch of people that have done Kickstarters, and I know it's just a lot of work.
Yeah.
Um, and honestly, I'm sure a lot of that's it'll probably be very healthy for me in a creative and business venture to do more of that work. And I'll probably wind up doing some more. But honestly, it's just been the lazy, whatever fanish part of me that has been able to be comfortable enough with most of my years at Marvel and DC because they handle all the complicated, crazy
Right.
stuff or whatever. I get to talk to them about the story, maybe see a script, or I might write a script for some of them. Um, uh, but as far as the hassles of publishing and printing and
Mhm.
all of that extra stuff going on, or coordinating their creative people to get it all gelled together. Um, you know, if I do Kickstarter and those other things, I'm going to have to,
Yeah.
put time and effort into all those things. And honestly, having my druthers, I'm just like, my happiest times except for my family or whatnot, are like leaving the rest of the world behind and only just getting to draw
Focus.
and do my artwork.
Yep.
There's a bunch of us. We always talk about the fact that is there like that miracle time, even since we were kids, and even now, like you strive, you hope for those times of like you get lost in the page, you get lost in the drawing. So all of a sudden you're like, it's 6 o'clock. How the heck did it become 6 o'clock? Okay, shoot. All right, I got to make dinner or something else going on right now. But you literally just dive yourself and you're lost in it, because not only is, I think, that magical connection the most fun for any of the creators that I know of,
Right.
I honestly think that that's a real part and important piece of the puzzle, for that magic to then translate to the pages and onto the readers and then the rest of them. Any of the books that only a rare variety, I think, were the creators, I think, not involved on some personal level with their books, for it to come through. I think it is one of those things of like, when they talk about musical instruments, or this great samurai sword that you might get a hold of, the samurai sword, you can feel the
Right.
energy in this sword when you hold it, kind of thing. I think that same way it's transferred through the papers, and we're telling stories. So if you want your readers to be involved with these characters and have some whatever belief in them, that you
Right.
can get that enjoyment out of them, of watching them go through these trials or heartaches or whatever it's going to be, you got to be involved with it. It's people putting into the stuff, but then it's that magical thing of the other person getting it out. And I think if we only did it half-hearted and weren't always necessarily that personally involved with it, I think more often that, unless you're just a brilliant guy like, I don't know, Michael Bolden, he could probably not care all in the world, but he'd
Right.
still do a brilliant page. But that's one out of 1,000 guys to do it. I think the rest of us, we really do need to sweat blood and tears and whatnot into these pages to make them worthwhile for the reader.
I know there's still many, many years left in your career, but as of this moment, if someone said to
Hopefully.
you, they say, well, what do you do for a living? If you pick out one thing that you at your best, could you do that yet?
Like the best job I've ever done in the past, could I replicate it
Right.
now?
Something that you look at and you're like, you know what? This is firing on all cylinders.
Generally, I'll say yes, but I will allow, to my mind, that fact that, um, as a whole, some of the projects, when you're first breaking in, um, and I've heard a bunch of different artists and actors and directors and also kind of talk about this too, there can be this like magical fifth element to any of those early projects you did when you basically had no idea what you were doing, or you had no idea the mountain that you were climbing or anything else that was going on with that, or how it was going to be received 6 months later. None of those things were entering your mind. You just blindly drew what you drew. And even though in some ways artistically you could point at it, it's like, well, his anatomy was a little off on this,
Right.
but there could be that just blind youthful ambition or energy that goes into stuff. um, I like to think I'm a much better artist than a drawer, and a more conscientious artist in putting all these stories together. And on certain levels, I think there's absolutely no question that I think I could blow away anything that I've done in the past, as good as it might be as an actual storyteller and those kind of things.
Right.
I'm always striving to be better at that, and I think I honestly am, like, at my best of anything in the past. I think I'm 10 times a storyteller that I ever was, at bare minimum. But as far as like all of a sudden getting that really cool face that had that really cool expression or whatever, and then it just kind of rolled off of the pencil once in a while, those are a little tougher to come by once in a while. And there is that thing of like, as much as I try and focus and think about all the aspects of what I can do to make this artwork better, or the drawing better, or the storytelling better on this whole thing, there is a piece of it, I think, that also plays in there, where there's a little bit of the negative side where you could overthink it. You can spend too much time thinking about it, So then all of a sudden that unconscious flow of something doesn't
Mhm.
come as easy.
What are some projects coming up that fans could be looking forward to?
The biggest thing, of course, is Patra behind me.
Right.
Some other stuff you can see a little more closely. This is the 4-issue miniseries. 3 of the issues are out right now. It's
Mhm.
one,
That's
two,
awesome.
and then issue 3. And I'll show you too. Yeah, get another reflection. Um, give you the viewers a hint about the work in there. I'm doing all the coloring, all the artwork. I have a hand in some of the writing, but James is obviously very much the writer and the scripter and the whole bit. We had a mix of ideas between what I wanted to do in a horror comic book and what he wanted to do. I showed him the little girl with the skull mask,
Right.
and then we went from there. And he goes, "Oh, I've got these other ideas I want to bring into it." But like, I don't know how well it's going to be seen,
Wow.
but it's that kind of crazy level of line work and everything that I've
Gee
gotten
whiz.
into working on this project.
Huh. That's a
So,
wow.
this is the big one for me right now. I'm still in the middle of it. James is talking to Dark Horse about the next one. We
Okay.
definitely want to do more. We've only started her story. In fact, that was one of the other major differences between what we had coming into it. I only had the 1-issue series, which is kind of mostly related to what we have here.
Mhm.
By the end of my initial story, if I would have done it all on my own, excuse me, it would have been finished. The whole conflict would have been pretty much resolved at the end of it.
Right.
But James, being the writer that he is, and all the creative genius and whatnot that he's got going on, he went, "Oh, but if we do this, or if we do this and this," and I'm like, "Oh God, yeah, no, now we've got like 10 miniseries we could do. This could, this would be great if we could keep going." So that's our main trick right now, is trying to make sure we keep getting the word out there on Patra, um, and try and get sales for it, because again, it's nice to be in this modern world where we do have all these opportunities to do different projects now, and it's not just Marvel and DC
Right.
that are ruling the roost anymore. There's tons of different places to go, Boom and Image and all these different things.
Mhm.
IDW, the list goes on. Uh, but at that same time, I almost feel like comics are all the way have become like cable or streaming television now, where you literally have so many possibilities that are out there almost every month. It's all nearly impossible for the stores to order the books or know which books to order. And then in that same framework, there have been times now, because I've been so busy with stuff, and I've recently moved to different things. I haven't been to a comic book store much in the
Right.
last few years. I go into a store now and I'm like, holy cow, look, there's 300 titles. I had no idea that were even out. This isn't Batman and Wolverine. This
Right.
is the millions of other things that are going on, which is great.
Yep.
But it's also daunting to not only get that stuff and see it, but in my case, to get a word out like Patra or something like that and get people to have eyes on it. It's a bit of a challenge, and I won't mince around with it. Our sales on Patra are like razor thin as far as like being viable, in this world of things going on.
Mhm.
But I also know that the other main way to deal with these things is to the best you can roll up your sleeves, keep costs at an absolute minimum as we're trying to put all this stuff together, but get the first issue the mini series out with the trade or whatnot. Shoot for the second one. Make sure that's done. 3 of them, 4 miniseries, something, so you can have a presence on the shelf.
Mhm.
I've heard it said many times from store owners that if they get someone, either a regular reader who's bored and he's read all of his regular books and he's looking for something new or interesting or
Mhm.
whatnot, or if you get that brand new reader who's coming in and they talk to the store owner about what to do, the store owner could say, "Here's this new book, Patra," and they'll go, "Okay, but there's just a couple issues out. I want to read a lot." Or they also have in the back of their mind, according to the store owners, that it's untried. They don't know if this book's gonna be good or not because there's only 2, 3 issues out so far. As
Mhm.
much as we're busting our butts on this, and as much as we have good reviews all over the place for this book, um, if the store owner then shows them, okay, but we have 8 editions of Fables or different other books out there that they could lean
Right.
to, They go, oh, well, that's been out for 8 miniseries or more or whatever going on. That's tried and true. I'm going to roll the dice on that one. Plus, if it works out right, which you hope it will, then they've got 8 giant books to read instead of the one miniseries that they could finish, this week or next week or whatever it is. So that's the big thing right now for me is doing the best I can of this book. And I have lots of other creator-owned books that I want to do in the future. Um, so it's going to be juggling all of those kind of things, and then still, fitting in stuff for Marvel and DC once in a while. But at the same time, I also know as I was breaking in, the guys that aren't 20-year-old anymore
Mhm.
aren't always the guys that Marvel and DC are looking for. They're looking for those hot new young artists a lot of times, unless you can like finagle a way to appear to be a hot new
Right.
young artist. So I know that part of my publishing future is going to be spotty as far as dealing with them. I'm not going to have all the opportunities that I had when I was 25 or 30 years old or any of those things. So it'll be balancing all that stuff, but at the same time, I'm not, in any sort of negative view
Right.
about any of this stuff. I'm excited about all the possibilities of doing Patra or doing, what I did last year, a couple issues of Blue Beetle thing, or they'll call me for another Flash job or this or that. All of those things. That's all fine. That's all on the table. I'll
Mhm.
enjoy it all, including that idea of that I think they call it now a legacy artist on some of these characters, like an Avengers thing, like a Flash thing, or whatever else, something that I've known for drawing before.
Right.
Um, that I could be called back again for any of those publishing companies. Um, I've heard plenty of the stories of other creators in the past. I'm going to throw out an example out here, but I don't know that this is true.
Okay.
Like a Gil Kane on Green Lantern.
Mhm.
Even up until Gil's last days, he was getting extra Green Lantern work. I don't know verbatim in there, but I think I heard stories, but I could be completely wrong
Mhm.
in the fact that Gil was like, Green Lantern again, right?
Right.
Um, all of us, I think, at some point on any of the characters that we're known for, run into that at some point. I mean, even for crying out loud, Mike Mignola on Hellboy, at some point, he got tired, obviously, of doing
Right.
Hellboy as a monthly book because he stopped twice. Um, so you're going to reach those points of dealing with all that stuff. But for me, where I am, at least currently, I've come to even being more than at peace with that sort of thing. Because honestly, there were times, like I said, when I left Flash at 200, I did feel like I had hit that wall. Like, I don't know if I can do anything better with this. Might just be repeating myself. But now I've come up with different opportunities. I did Flash a couple years ago with Joshua Williamson,
Right.
and I took the job because I thought it'd be fun at the time, and it fit into the schedule really well.
Mhm.
I thought this would be great, but there was that intrepid kind of whatever nervousness at the beginning where I was like, I don't know, am I going to be able to? Will the magic happen again? Will I be able to pull this off month after month? Am I going to be able to do this thing? Am I going to be able to make it fun for me? Therefore, hopefully, fun for new readers or readers that have read my stuff before. Am I going to be able to do that trick as good as or better than before?
Mhm.
And I think there were issues within that where I did that. So that's where you mentioned before about those different blocks or hurdles that you get in with your artwork. I reached that point at one point with the Flash where, for a while, doing commissions of the Flash or Flash related stuff, or more pages of him or this or that, I was like, I always feel like I'm just doing the same thing, same thing. I don't feel that way hardly at all anymore.
Mhm.
I know there's times when I have to break my habit that I all of a sudden my first gut instinct might have been to do something that I'd done before, even if I don't think of that
Right.
exactly going like, oh, this was Flash from 178 or whatever going on. Like, oh yeah, that I would just naturally start drawing that pose again. And occasionally a friend would remind me of going like, oh, you've done that one. You've done that one 10 times. And you go, oh, right. Yeah. But all during that last run that I had with Williamson, I found a lot of other fun with it. And sometimes it's even just a matter of, even if it's the same character, you've changed the writer, you've
Right.
changed the color team on the book or letter or whoever else. Um, and that can sometimes be enough too to like kick in that system, feeling like it's
Right.
still a fresh project.
And we are back. I mean, gee whiz, the amount of projects Scott has been on, like big name projects, not just one-offs. It's absolutely mind blowing, and his art. If you haven't seen it, Google it, guys. It's really worth checking out. One of the best guys working in the business today, and obviously, as you can tell from this interview, one of the nicest guys working in the interview today, working in the industry today, I should say. Sorry, folks. little off. So thank you, Scott. We'd love to have you back, guys. We'd like to have you back. So come on back on Friday. We have another episode for you, and we will see you then. Bye.